Okay. So just to give a little kind of background, for a number of years now I've been sort of focused on how different forms of knowledge related to sort of policing and security and warfare travel geographically. And in doing so, I've focused a lot on the representation of Palestine and Israel as a key laboratory or node of global violence. So I've turned this critical body of literature, including activist scholarship as well as scholarship, the so-called laboratory thesis. So the thesis suggests that the occupied Palestinian territories function as zones of real-world experimentation in which new weapons and surveillance techniques are tested. Access to these so-called laboratory spaces allegedly allows Israeli security firms to improve their products and services, but also to sort of brand them as combat-proofing. So the laboratory thesis has advanced our understanding of how Israel sustains its settler colonial project. Yet I argue in some of my work that the thesis overlooks sites of failure and difficulty encountered both in producing and circulating policing knowledge globally. This, I want to suggest today, has come at a significant cost. So today my core position is that thinking about questions of failure and difficulty more centrally in relation to the production and circulation of policing knowledge is both necessary and ultimately fruitful. So I'm going to situate my remarks today in relation to Israel's violent repression of the recent Great March of Return protests in Gaza. I'll start by showing how the events have been read by a number of critics of the Israeli state, and then present a kind of alternative interpretation. Following this, I'll outline two twin concepts that I'm currently working on, namely settling failure and waging success. So the Great March of Return protest began on March 30th, 2018. At the core of the protest is the demand for Palestinian refugees and their descendants to be allowed to return to the places they were displaced from since the Nakba, or catastrophe, in 1948. Since March, Israeli security forces have killed an estimated 190, including children, medics, and journalists, as well as maiming thousands more, relying extensively on snipers shooting at very close range. So you can see this in kind of the image where you have the protests, and then you have the snipers close by, sort of picking people off. So this crackdown has also revived discussions of the idea of Gaza as a so-called laboratory. For instance, in this report by the Israeli group Coalition for Women for Peace. It covers a range of issues, but advances two specific claims relevant to my remarks today. First, it alleges the new kinds of innovation in Israeli strategies of violence. As it notes, quote, "The Great Return March revealed two newly developing Israeli security forces strategies: the increased use of snipers in eliminating threats, and the use of drones in controlling and dispersing crowds." A range of other sort of critical journalists and human rights groups have further alleged the use of so-called experimental, explosive forms of ammunition, thereby threatening to violate the long-standing international prohibitions on their use in relation to warfare. So in this way, Gaza's status as a, quote, laboratory is invoked to understand an apparent recent shift in the nature of Israeli violence. Second, the report references real-world testing in order to explain the mobility of certain technologies and practices of repression. It argues that, quote, because they proved successful from the beginning, the Israeli Ministry of Defense purchased hundreds of additional drones the night after the first large-scale demonstrations in Gaza and at the end of March. Indeed, while emphasizing the apparent tactical shift in terms of how Palestinians were being targeted, the report suggests the exploitation of the Great March as a source of knowledge and profit represents, quote, business as usual. So to be clear, such reports provide crucial information that counter Israel's representations of its violence as normal, proportional, and justified. Yet in their efforts to explain shifts in the apparent nature of Israeli violence, they obscure and overlook much as well. So the first issue that I'll discuss today concerns apparent shifts in the nature of Israeli violence. For instance, allegations of the use of explosive bullets have been challenged. As one weapons expert recently convincingly argued, the nature of the wounds found on victims of Gaza can be readily explained simply by the close proximity of the sniper to their targets rather than due to the use of explosive bullets. In addition, the wounds suffered during the Great March were only unusual in the sense that they resemble those from Israel's previous operations, military operations in Gaza. The Israeli killing of Palestinian civilians with snipers per se is thus categorically not new. But even more importantly, the critical focus on exposing forms of escalation and innovation can result in a kind of misplaced political focus. It can imply that under normal conditions, Israeli settler colonial violence is somehow more normal, proportional, reasonable, or acceptable. In this sense, it falls into the long-standing trap of critiques in terms of militarization, police brutality, and privatization, which narrowly focus on curtailing perceived exceptional excesses of state violence rather than confronting its systemic and routinized character. Second, the laboratory's thesis conceptions of real-world testing and, quote, proving success are both thin and tautological. For instance, the Coalition of Women for Peace report essentially treats evidence that Israel's Ministry of Defense purchased drones following their use as evidence that they worked successfully. Yet when we look at what actually happened during the Great March, beyond a very superficial level, these conceptions of testing and success do not exactly hold up. In contrast to the idea of laboratory testing as a process which definitively proves the efficiency of subduing anti-colonial struggle, I want to argue that the results of Israel's repression of the Great March are anything but obvious or settled. Alternatively, the visibility of these atrocities gave rise to contestations among a range of actors surrounding the basic facts on the ground, who got killed, how many and by whom, as well as what these deaths signified and who bore responsibility for them. And within this struggle, I want to argue, Israeli officials to attempt to explain their targeting of protesters as advanced, precise, and deliberate became key sites of contestation. For instance, a tweet on March 31st from the official IDF spokesperson account asserted, quote, "Yesterday we saw 30,000 people. We arrived prepared and with precise reinforcements. Nothing was carried out uncontrolled. Everything was accurate and measured, and we know where every bullet landed." Yet this tweet was quickly reinterpreted by the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem as an official Israeli acceptance of responsibility for committing a war crime. Thus, while it's attempting to kind of explain and rationalize violence against Palestinians to an international audience as precise, controlled, and measured, this move ultimately backfired, increasing rather than reducing controversy. Israeli officials encountered further difficulty in representing their killings as innovative or even specifically Israeli to international onlookers. So the vast majority of sniper rifles used to repress the Great March were American manufactured rather than Israeli manufactured. And this reliance on US-made weapons seems to have complicated Israel's efforts to use its Gaza massacre as a showcase for Israeli innovation in the crafts of violence, threatening rather than facilitating business as usual. As Israeli political economist Shir Hever noted during his remarks on the attacks, quote, "The previous attacks on Gaza, the Israeli military specifically showcased their use of Israeli weapons in these attacks because they wanted to sell them. But as he continued, this time we don't see that because they're using American weapons in addition to a number of Israeli-made weapons as well, suggesting, quote, that the Israeli strategy of using the Gaza Strip as a laboratory is collapsing." So to be clear, I have some reservations that this supposed collapse is perhaps as new or as totalizing a development as Shir Hever implies. Nevertheless, he signals to something important. The simple fact of Israeli security forces meting out violence does not itself guarantee a set of obvious or predetermined lessons will automatically be circulated elsewhere. So one of my main criticisms of the laboratory thesis is that it leaves little room for questions of disruptions or difficulties because it portrays an understanding of real-world testing that is always and inherently successful. I've therefore begun to look for alternative theoretical sources of inspiration to imagine the idea of policing and security laboratories. Here I found literature from Science and Technologies Studies, or STS, particularly helpful because it challenges the myth of science as rational, ordered, and instrumental. In doing so, STS scholars have usually questioned the notion that facts are simply reflections of material reality on the ground, alternatively situating laboratories and their central role in the, quote, fabrication of knowledge. As Michel Callan and his colleagues put it, quote, the laboratory is a machine for producing inscriptions, for making possible their discussion, interpretation, and mobilization. The famous data givens of experience are never given. They are obtained, made, or fabricated. STS further provides a framework through which to make sense of how certain forms of knowledge and practices and technologies become generalized without conceding that this outcome reflects their superiority. Indeed, STS scholars like Bruno Latour and others closely grapple with issues of success and failure in understanding broader questions of institutional reproduction, drawing attention to how outcomes of policies and projects are negotiated and thereby settled as successes or failures. This approach to the uncertain and negotiated interface between success and failure, I want to argue, is helpful in understanding how protracted settler violence can be represented as successful, inevitable, and desirable by taking these fabrications seriously for what they are, namely as highly inventive and indeed often very questionable lessons of empire that are always at risk of stumbling and being undone. STS's core focus on the uncertain interface between success and failure also resonates with recent reconsiderations about how to define settler colonialism itself. As Anne-Laura Stoller has recently invited us to reconsider the prevailing idea of settler colonialism as a unique type or fixed set of relations of colonial domination. As she argues, quote, settler colonialism is no more fixed and given than are any colonial formations that assert their illegitimate claims. Settler colonialism might be better understood not as a unique type, but as the effect of a failed or protracted contest over the appropriation and dispossession that is not over when victories are declared, killings are accomplished, and decimation is resolved as the only solution. Settler colonialism is only ever an imperial process in formation whose security apparatus confirms that it is always at the risk of being undone. So drawing on these insights, I now want to briefly outline two concepts I'm beginning to develop, namely settling failure and waging success. Both of these terms address how the categories of failure and success are manufactured and also policed discursively. The notion of settling failure seeks to take more seriously that the recurring failures found in produce of settler colonization are not incidental and indeed central to developing and circulating policing knowledge. As Stoller suggests, questions about failure are never resolved because contemporary settler projects are defined by the recurring failures. Yet in order for settler projects to appear as teleological and instrumental, these failures need to be constantly resettled over and over through forms of rationalization. As such, I want to suggest that the process of settling failure represents the core of how settler colonial projects maintain their global legitimacy and claims to permanence and inevitability in light of the constant practical challenges encountered in practices of colonial dispossession. This leads me to my second concept that I'm developing, namely the idea of waging success. So in relation to the instruments of violence used to repress the Great March, I've questioned whether testing them in practice really proved the merits one way or another. What is clear, however, is that the exercise of violence in real-world scenarios certainly can serve as the kind of raw material for rationalizing these policy interventions and promoting their adoption elsewhere. The notion of waging success therefore takes as its starting point that success is always a contingent and uncertain accomplishment, rather than a reflection of some stable material reality. Following this, waging success situates the process of rationalization as an ongoing public relations war in its own right, thereby challenging the idea that settler colonial projects succeed or fail merely on the basis of the degrees or types of violence they employ. The notions of settling failure and waging success also resonate a little bit with the notion of pacification that Mark outlined yesterday. Pacification is closely associated with violent colonial dispossession, but the concept also insists on foregrounding pacification's productive nature in the sense that pacification is the fabrication of order, which includes but also exceeds the exercise of brute violence. My work is developing this emphasis on productivity further. The notion of waging success specifically emphasizes that although the mobilization of policing knowledge is fundamentally wedded to the exercise of violence, knowledge does not arise naturally or in lockstep with patterns of killing. As a concept, pacification also places a central emphasis on theorizing security projects and their roles in order formation as essentially unfinished projects. So here I want to emphasize that the productivity of pacification projects in terms of knowledge production goes hand in hand with their inherently unfulfilled and ever unfolding qualities. In other words, we take seriously that pacification projects are ever and always ongoing rather than fulfilled or settled. So too are the practices of emergent knowledge, the practices and emergent forms of knowledge that these projects rely on and generate. Thanks very much.